I promise to love and cherish you for all the days of my life.
The knife drew a bead of blood against Dae Hyunwoo's throat, a momentary lapse that ended instantly as the assassin dropped, a silent heap with a syringe in his neck. Hyunwoo was 33 and he had learned that death was less a monster and more a business consultant, present at every major deal. He maintained a steady pulse and stepped over the body, letting his security detail perform their sterile cleanup. The neon-lit city below his penthouse was ignorant of the violence that kept its systems running. This was the third assassination attempt in 2 months, a predictable uptick, and Hyunwoo knew exactly why. The stakes had been raised, the world was fighting back, and the answer was absurd, reckless, and wholly, utterly driven by desire. The marriage wasn't protection, it was provocation. It was a kiss shared over a fresh grave, and it was supposed to change absolutely everything. Power, his uncle had explained over whiskey that cost more than most people's monthly rent, required perception management. The Dae family's reputation had become too sharp, too dangerous, scaring away legitimate investors while emboldening rivals who saw brutality as an invitation rather than a warning. What they needed, his uncle insisted with the confidence of a man who had orchestrated empires, was softness. Not weakness, but the appearance of humanity, a beautiful distraction that would make the world forget the bodies buried beneath their empire's foundation. A strategic union with a woman so removed from their world that her very presence would suggest redemption, transformation, the possibility that monsters could become men. Hyunwoo had listened without interruption, his face revealing nothing, because emotion was a language he had been forbidden to speak since childhood. When his uncle finished, sliding a dossier across the polished desk, Hyunwoo asked only one question. Does she know what she's agreeing to? His uncle's smile had been cold enough to frost the air between them. She knows what we need her to know. That answer told him everything. They were purchasing a prop, a living, breathing accessory to humanize the inhuman. And somewhere across the world, a woman was being sold a fantasy that would shatter the moment she crossed his threshold. They described her as educated, graceful, grateful for the opportunity. Words that felt like walls closing in rather than windows opening. When Hyunwoo tried to imagine her, his mind offered only blurred edges, a phantom bride who would smile on command and disappear into the background of his meticulously controlled existence. He wondered what promises had been wrapped around the truth like silk around razor wire. What version of him had been presented as salvation rather than damnation. The night before the ceremony, he stood alone on his balcony, soul sprawling beneath him like a kingdom built on secrets and blood, and felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: fear. Not of bullets or betrayal, but of the moment when a real human being would look at him and realize she had been traded into a beautiful cage. The wedding venue was a cathedral of calculated extravagance, every detail designed to broadcast power disguised as elegance. White roses cascaded from 20-foot ceilings like frozen waterfalls, their perfume so thick it felt like breathing wealth itself. Crystal chandeliers scattered light across faces that watched with the intensity of predators evaluating new territory. Business associates who smiled with too many teeth. Politicians who attended because refusing the invitation would have been career suicide. Rivals who came to assess weakness and left empty-handed or didn't leave at all. His father stood rigid with satisfaction, surveying the assembled crowd like a general reviewing conquered lands. His mother's expression remained glacially neutral, her approval always conditional, always measured in what he could provide rather than who he was. Hyunwoo positioned himself at the altar, spine perfectly straight, face composed into the mask he had perfected over 3 decades of survival. His heartbeat remained steady despite the weight of hundreds of eyes cataloguing his every micro-expression. The officiant began speaking in rehearsed cadences, words that had been spoken at 1,000 weddings and would be spoken at 1,000 more, emptied of meaning through repetition. Then the music shifted, and the crowd's collective attention pivoted like a single organism responding to stimulus. She moved through the parted guests with a presence that didn't announce itself but simply existed, undeniable and complete. Hyunwoo maintained his composure, his expression locked, but when the veil lifted, reality detonated every assumption he had constructed as armor against this moment. Evelyn stood before him like a challenge to everything he thought he understood about control and predetermined outcomes. Her dark skin seemed to absorb and transform the light, making her glow from within rather than simply reflecting the artificial brilliance around them. But it was her eyes that shattered his carefully maintained distance. They met him with a directness that bypassed every defense he had spent years constructing, not aggressive but absolutely present, seeing him rather than the reputation that preceded him. She didn't bow or lower her gaze in performative submission. She didn't smile with the grateful relief they had promised she would display. She simply stood there, fully inhabiting herself, and Hyunwoo felt something crack in his chest, like ice breaking after a long winter. "I've been curious about the man behind all the careful descriptions," she said, her voice carrying warmth that seemed impossible given the transactional nature of their arrangement, and the sound moved through him like the first note of music after years of silence. He opened his mouth to deliver one of the polished responses he had prepared, something appropriately distant, yet polite. But what emerged instead was truth. "I hope the reality isn't too disappointing." Her lips curved into the smallest smile, and he realized with startling clarity that nothing about this woman or this moment or whatever was beginning between them would follow the script others had written. This was not a transaction unfolding according to plan. This was something entirely different, and it terrified him more than any assassination attempt ever had. Evelyn had learned before her 10th birthday that survival often required becoming invisible, that stillness could be a form of power when movement attracted predators. At 27, she carried herself with the hard-won confidence of someone who had navigated impossible choices and emerged with her soul intact, even when circumstances had tried to strip everything else away. When the proposal arrived through intermediaries who spoke in beautiful euphemisms that couldn't quite disguise the transaction beneath, she had seen it clearly for what it was. Her mother's crushing medical debt would evaporate like morning fog. Her younger brother would attend the university that had existed only as a painful dream. Her sister would escape the dangerous circumstances that had been slowly consuming her. And Evelyn would become the wife of a man whose name was spoken in whispers that mixed fear with reluctant respect. She had accepted not because she believed the fantasy they were selling, but because she understood leverage when she held it. They needed her specific combination of attributes, her education, her poise, her foreignness that would make their family seem progressive rather than predatory. She needed resources to save the people she loved. The math was brutal but clear. What she hadn't anticipated was the possibility that the man himself might be more than the carefully curated monster they had prepared her for. Standing before the altar in a country where even the air tasted different, she felt hundreds of eyes measuring her against expectations she would never fully understand. They were cataloguing her worth, calculating how well she fit the narrative they had already constructed, wondering if she would break or bend or simply disappear. But when Hyunwoo looked at her, something in his expression disrupted every assumption she had made to protect herself from disappointment. He didn't examine her with clinical detachment or project ownership through performative charm. He looked genuinely startled, almost vulnerable, as if the reality of her had jolted him awake from a nightmare he hadn't realized he'd been trapped in. There was recognition in his eyes, not of her specifically, but of something shared, some understanding that they were both prisoners in golden cages built by other people's ambitions. As the ceremony progressed through its predetermined choreography, their hands were guided together, his palm surprisingly warm despite the tension radiating from his controlled stillness. She moved closer when tradition demanded, speaking the practiced phrases she had memorized on the 14-hour flight, and noticed how his breathing changed when she was near, a subtle shift in the architecture of his composure that told her more than his carefully neutral expression ever could. "You weren't expecting me to be real," she murmured during a pause meant for silence, testing the boundaries of this fragile construction, curious if he would retreat behind formality or meet her honesty with his own. He paused and she watched something flicker across his face, some internal debate about safety versus authenticity. When he spoke, his voice was pitched low enough that the words existed only in the charged space between their bodies. "They briefed me on every detail except the ones that matter," he confessed. "They told me what you looked like, where you studied, what you would bring to this arrangement, but they forgot to mention you would be a person." The vulnerability in those words, rough and unpolished, sparked something dangerous in her chest. Hope. She allowed herself a small smile, not performance but genuine response. "They promised me you would treat me like furniture. Beautiful, expensive, but ultimately decorative and silent." His attention sharpened with something that looked like actual interest, and for the first time since boarding the plane that carried her away from everything familiar, Evelyn felt the stirring of possibility rather than resignation. Maybe this wouldn't be just survival. Maybe this could be something else entirely. When the officiant declared them bound, applause cascaded through the hall like an avalanche. But the sound felt distant, muffled, as though the genuine moment existed only in the microscopic space where their hands connected. As they turned to face the assembled witnesses, Hyunwoo leaned fractionally closer, his breath warm against her ear. "Whatever performance they expect from us, whatever role they've scripted, we write the actual story ourselves." She searched his face for deception, for the practiced manipulation she had steeled herself against, and found instead a guarded authenticity that mirrored her own, carefully protected hope. "Then honesty becomes our foundation," she replied, and his nod felt like the first step onto unmapped territory they would have to navigate together, blind but not alone. The reception unfolded with orchestrated grandeur, every detail designed to broadcast power and taste in equal measure. But beneath the polished surface, Hyunwoo found himself doing something unexpected. Watching her. Not with the clinical assessment he applied to business associates or the suspicious scrutiny he turned on rivals, but with genuine curiosity about who this woman actually was beneath the role she had been purchased to play. Evelyn navigated the room with a composure that refused to diminish itself for anyone's comfort. She engaged with elders using respect without subservience, asked thoughtful questions that demonstrated she was listening rather than simply waiting for her turn to speak. And when she contributed to conversations, her words commanded attention through substance rather than volume. She was neither invisible nor aggressively present, simply undeniably herself. And Hyunwoo watched his business associates react with barely concealed surprise, their calculations visibly adjusting as they realized this woman would not be the decorative prop they had anticipated. When she finally joined him at the table reserved for appearances of unity, he leaned close enough that his words wouldn't carry beyond her. "You move through this room like someone who isn't afraid of these people." She took a measured sip of champagne, and he noticed how she held the glass, confident but not pretentious, present but not performing. "Terror doesn't disappear simply because your circumstances change," she said, her voice steady. "It merely learns when to speak and when to stay silent." Her answer lodged itself somewhere in his chest, resonating with truths he had spent years trying to bury beneath layers of necessity and obligation. Later, when tradition demanded they withdraw briefly from the performance, they found themselves alone in a private room overlooking the city's endless constellation of lights. The silence between them held weight, but not hostility. filled with questions neither knew how to voice yet. Hyunwoo removed his jacket, draping it over a chair as if shedding a costume, and she watched him with eyes that saw more than he was comfortable revealing. "I want to establish clear expectations," he said, his tone professional, the same voice he used in boardrooms where millions changed hands based on his inflection. "I don't expect affection. I'm not seeking love. I need cooperation, discretion, and public unity. Beyond that, your life is your own." Evelyn studied him for a long moment, her gaze travelling across his face as if reading a language written in the tension of his jaw, the careful control of his posture. "I don't offer affection where respect doesn't exist," she replied, her voice gentle but firm. "But I also won't show indifference if something genuine begins to grow. I refuse to live in pretense. I've done that before, and it nearly destroyed me." He considered her words, turning them over in his mind like artifacts from a civilization he had only read about but never visited. Then he allowed himself something rare and dangerous. A genuine smile, small and uncertain, like a muscle remembering how to move after years of disuse. "That seems like a fair foundation." And in that exchange, the arrangement began its first subtle transformation from imprisonment into something that resembled partnership. As they returned to the hall, moving in unconsciously synchronized steps, Hyunwoo felt an unexpected protective instinct stir, born not from possession but from recognition. He understood with sudden clarity that the alliance designed to control him might instead become the catalyst for something neither faction had anticipated, and that the woman beside him was not a weakness to be managed, but a force whose very presence challenged the careful distance he had maintained from hope itself. The days that followed unfolded like a chess game, where both players were still learning the rules. The residence assigned to them sprawled with impersonal grandeur, all marble surfaces and floor-to-ceiling windows, designed to impress visitors and intimidate inhabitants. Yet, Evelyn moved through the space with curiosity instead of intimidation, asking about the artwork's provenance, the building's architecture, the city's history, and the routines Hyunwoo followed with almost ritualistic precision. He answered where he could, deflecting when questions brushed too close to dangerous truths about his family's operations, yet finding himself more transparent than strategy advised. There was something disarming about her curiosity, the way she listened as if his words actually mattered rather than simply cataloguing information for later use. One evening, as they sat across from each other sharing a meal that felt almost normal despite the armed guards stationed throughout the building, she asked a question that stopped his chopsticks mid-air. "Do you ever question the path that was carved for you before you could walk?" He paused, the question hitting something tender beneath his armor. "Questioning assumes alternatives exist," he said finally, his voice careful. "I learned young that some destinies are written before you take your first breath. Resistance just means you suffer more on the way to the inevitable." She nodded, her expression soft with understanding rather than pity. "I believe choices persist even when the options seem eliminated," she said. "Sometimes the choice is just smaller than we want it to be, but it's still there, still real, still ours." Her conviction unsettled him. Not because it was naive, but because it suggested a freedom he had dismissed as fantasy years ago. And hearing her speak about it made him wonder if he had been wrong. When threats materialized, subtle and coded in the language of his world, Hyunwoo's instincts crystallized with laser focus. His attention narrowed around Evelyn's safety in ways that surprised and slightly alarmed him. He assigned additional security without explanation, monitored how rivals' gazes lingered on her, positioned himself between her and potential dangers with quiet insistence that became habit before he even noticed he was doing it. One night, after an incident that left tension humming through the household like electricity before a storm, she found him standing alone in the dimly lit office, staring at security footage without really seeing it. She approached quietly, her presence announced only by the subtle shift in air. "You don't need to construct fortresses around me constantly," she said gently, but with steel beneath the softness. He turned to face her, and she saw the exhaustion he usually hid so effectively. "Protection isn't imprisonment," he replied, his voice rougher than intended. "And I won't apologize for prioritizing your safety. You don't understand the world I operate in, the people who would use you to hurt me or my family." "Then explain it to me," she said, stepping closer. "Stop treating me like I'm too fragile for truth. I crossed an ocean to marry a stranger. I'm stronger than you're giving me credit for." The proximity between them felt charged with something fragile and promising, and in that moment, Hyunwoo realized the boundary he had drawn between obligation and desire was dissolving like salt in water, reshaped by a woman who refused to be reduced to a prop in someone else's strategy. "If something happened to you because of me," he said quietly, the admission costing him more than he expected, "I don't know if I could." He stopped, the rest of the sentence too revealing to complete, but she heard what he didn't say. She always did. Public scrutiny intensified as their union drew attention from media outlets and rival organizations alike, whispers circulating about the unexpected dynamic between them. At a formal gathering designed to test loyalty and appearances, Hyunwoo sensed the trap before it fully materialized. The questions carried edges sharpened with provocation, the smiles calculated to wound rather than welcome. When an influential businessman, emboldened by alcohol and an audience, made a comment about Evelyn's background that framed curiosity as casual racism, Hyunwoo felt rage flare white-hot beneath his controlled exterior. Before he could respond with the violence his reputation was built on, Evelyn spoke, her voice calm but absolutely immovable. "Where I'm from, we measure strength by what you survive, not by what you inherit," she said, her gaze unwavering on the man who had underestimated her. "And we measure character by how you treat people who can't benefit you. By that metric, I wonder how you'd measure up." The room fell into the kind of silence that precedes either violence or transformation. Hyunwoo placed a hand at the small of her back, a deliberate gesture of solidarity that communicated volumes without words. "My wife's insight is precisely why she belongs at my side," he added, his tone quiet but carrying the kind of finality that ended conversations. "Anyone who questions that is welcome to take it up with me, privately." The threat hung in the air, unmistakable to everyone present. The confrontation passed, but its impact reverberated through their world, reshaping perceptions and solidifying their connection in ways that felt both terrifying and inevitable. Later, alone once more in the sanctuary of their shared space, Evelyn turned to him with eyes that gleamed with something he couldn't quite name. "Why did you defend me so publicly? Your uncle will hear about this. It complicates things for your family." He didn't hesitate. "Because respect, once given, cannot be retracted without losing yourself in the process," he said. "And because anyone who disrespects you disrespects me. That's not complicated. That's clear." She reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his in a way that felt both intimate and profound, and he understood that something fundamental had shifted between them, some line crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. As the city lights shimmered beyond the windows like earthbound stars, Hyunwoo understood that the marriage he had steeled himself to endure was becoming something else entirely. A connection forged not by obligation alone, but by mutual recognition and a growing undeniable pull that neither could ignore or explain away as strategy. The space between them began to feel charged in ways that defied rational explanation. It was there in how his attention sought her whenever she entered a room, in the quiet magnetism he felt that seemed to adjust gravity itself around her presence. He noticed details he had trained himself not to see in other people. How her laughter, rare and genuine, smoothed the jagged edges of his thoughts. How her silence felt companionable rather than empty. how her proximity calmed something restless and violent in him that he had learned to accept as permanent. One evening, as twilight painted the city in copper and shadow, Evelyn stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, her silhouette outlined by fading light. She looked small against the vastness of the city, vulnerable in a way she never appeared when facing down businessmen or navigating social landmines. "You stare at this city as if it's stolen more than it's given," she said gently, not turning around. Hyunwoo joined her, standing close enough to sense her warmth radiating in the cool air conditioning. "It trained me in survival," he replied, his voice low and honest, in a way he rarely allowed. "It taught me how to read threats, how to strike first, how to bury emotions so deep it couldn't be used against me, but it never taught me about living, about existing as something other than a weapon." She turned then, her eyes searching his face with an intimacy that made his carefully controlled pulse stutter. "Maybe," she said softly, "that lesson doesn't come from places but from people. Maybe you've been looking in the wrong direction for the answer." The words settled between them like seeds falling on soil that had been barren for so long he'd forgotten anything could grow there. When her fingers found his hand, the touch felt intentional, unhurried, filled with unspoken understanding that bypassed language entirely. He didn't withdraw or deflect or make it something transactional. Instead, he wove his fingers through hers, the simple act carrying more vulnerability than any confession he had ever voiced. In that quiet moment, with the city sprawling below them and the weight of his world temporarily suspended, Hyunwoo realized how desperately he wanted to protect not just her physical safety but the fragile hope she awakened within him. The possibility that he might be more than what violence and necessity had shaped him into. Their connection deepened through moments that felt almost mundane, yet carried extraordinary significance. Shared mornings where conversation flowed as easily as the coffee they passed back and forth. Glances exchanged across crowded rooms that conveyed reassurance and solidarity without language. Late evenings where they sat close enough that their shoulders touched, discussing dreams they had once believed too dangerous or impractical to speak aloud. Evelyn spoke of her childhood with tenderness rather than resentment, painting pictures of poverty that couldn't quite extinguish hope, of a mother who worked 3 jobs and still found energy to read to her children, of siblings she would have done anything to protect. Hyunwoo listened, captivated not by the narrative alone but by the strength that lived beneath her vulnerability, the way she had transformed pain into compassion rather than bitterness. When he shared fragments of his own history, carefully edited stories about a childhood where affection was rationed and mistakes were punished with disappearance rather than discipline, she didn't recoil or try to fix what couldn't be fixed. She simply listened, her hand finding his in the darkness, her acceptance more healing than any words could have been. "You aren't defined exclusively by the violence you've survived or participated in," she told him one night, her voice steady as her hand rested against his chest, feeling his heart beat beneath her palm. "You're also defined by what you choose to protect, by the mercy you show when you could choose cruelty, by moments like this when you let yourself be human." Her touch lingered, grounding him, and he covered her hand with his, feeling the steady rhythm that proved he was alive rather than just functional. "I wasn't prepared to feel this," he admitted, the honesty raw and painful. "I didn't think I was capable of it anymore." "Neither was I," she replied, her lips curving into a soft smile that transformed her entire face. "But I'm not running from it, and I don't think you are either." When he leaned closer, resting his forehead against hers, the intimacy felt organic, inevitable, like water finding its level. And when their lips met, the kiss was tender and unhurried, filled with a reverence that spoke of mutual choice rather than obligation, of 2 people deciding to risk vulnerability rather than settling for safe distance. As the world outside continued to test them with threats both subtle and overt, Their bond became a sanctuary neither had anticipated. After tense negotiations where violence hummed beneath polite language, after encounters that left adrenaline coursing through his system for hours, Hyunwoo found solace in how Evelyn would seek him out. Her presence calmed the restless energy that usually took hours to dissipate, as if she possessed some frequency that could override the chaos embedded in his nervous system. One night, after an especially fraught encounter that had come within seconds of turning deadly, he stood alone in their bedroom, still wearing the clothes stained with another man's blood, tension coiled so tightly in his muscles he thought they might snap. Evelyn approached from behind, her arms wrapping around him, her cheek resting against his back. "You don't have to carry everything alone," she whispered, her voice carrying through him like a prayer or a promise. He exhaled slowly, the release almost painful after hours of holding everything in, and turned to face her. He cupped her face gently, his thumb tracing along her cheek as if memorizing every detail, committing her to memory in case this moment was all they would ever have. "I never imagined someone could make this existence feel less crushing," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought this was just what life was. Weight and obligation and violence with breathing space in between." Her eyes softened, gleaming with emotion that made his chest ache. "And I never imagined finding gentleness where I expected only coldness," she replied. "But here we are, against every odd and expectation." He kissed her then with a depth that surprised them both, the connection intense yet careful, as if they were discovering each other layer by layer, peeling back defenses they had built over lifetimes of protecting themselves from exactly this kind of vulnerability. When they finally separated, he rested his forehead against hers, their breaths mingling in the small space between them. "Stay with me," he said, not as a demand, but as a request shaped by hope and fear in equal measure. "Not because of the arrangement or what my family expects or what you agreed to. Stay because you choose this, because you chose me." "I'm not going anywhere," she answered simply, and the certainty in her voice anchored him more firmly than any oath or contract ever could. Public perception shifted as their unity became undeniable, as even the most skeptical observers couldn't dismiss the genuine connection between them. But it was in private moments that their romance truly flourished. They learned each other's rhythms, the comfortable silence that needed no filling, the reassurance found in small gestures that communicated what language couldn't capture. Hyunwoo began to imagine a future not merely survived but embraced, one where love didn't diminish his capacity for the ruthlessness his position required, but gave him something worth being ruthless for. Evelyn, sensing the transformation in him and in herself, encouraged without pressure, reminding him through actions rather than words that love could coexist with strength, that vulnerability wasn't weakness, but a different kind of courage. "What we choose matters more than what others intended for us," she said one evening, her hand entwined with his as they stood on the balcony watching the city pulse with life below them. "They tried to write our story, but we're the ones holding the pen now." When he looked at her then, really looked at her in the dying light, he saw not just the woman he had married, but the partner he had chosen, the person who had slipped past every defense he'd constructed and settled into his heart with quiet inevitability that felt like fate but was really choice, repeated over and over in 1,000 small moments. "I choose you," he said, the words simple but profound, carrying weight of every decision he'd made to let her in, to risk hoping, to believe that maybe he deserved something other than the violence and isolation he'd been raised to expect. Her smile was radiant, filled with warmth and certainty that seemed to generate its own light. She leaned into his embrace, fitting against him as if they'd been designed for exactly this configuration, and the world beyond them faded into beautiful irrelevance. In that shared space high above a city built on secrets and blood, love was no longer a risk to be calculated or a weakness to be managed, but a truth to be honored. And Hyunwoo knew with absolute certainty that whatever storms awaited them, whatever violence his family business would demand, whatever prices they would have to pay for choosing each other, they would face it all bound not by obligation alone, but by a devotion that had grown unexpectedly, irresistibly, impossibly real. If this story moved something in you, if you felt the tension and the tenderness, the danger and the hope, then hit that like button and subscribe to this channel because we're just getting started. Drop a comment telling me whose perspective you connected with more, Hyunwoo's or Evelyn's, and why. And click that notification bell so you don't miss our next journey into the complicated, beautiful, messy reality of love that blooms in impossible places. Remember, the most powerful transformations happen when we're brave enough to choose connection over safety, when we risk everything for the possibility of something real. Until next time, keep choosing courage.